Hello everyone, and welcome back to Chill and Feel Chronicles. Wherever you are in the world, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below and say hello. And if you enjoy relaxing journeys through history, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another adventure into the past. Now, dim the lights, settle into a comfortable seat, and let your imagination carry you back nearly 2,000 years. The first rays of dawn slowly creep across the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. A vast silence hangs over the frozen landscape. Snow blankets towering stone fortresses, softening their hard edges beneath a layer of brilliant white. Roman sentries stand motionless along the icy walls, wrapped in heavy cloaks, their breath rising like ghostly clouds into the freezing morning air. Beyond the frontier stretches an endless sea of dark pine forests, where the wind whistles through the trees with a lonely, haunting voice. In this remote corner of the empire, winter is more than a season, it is an enemy waiting patiently outside the gates. How did Roman soldiers survive freezing winters hundreds of miles from home? What happened when snow buried roads, isolated entire forts, and cut the empire's northern frontier off from the rest of the world? Could even Rome's legendary discipline overcome hunger, bitter cold, and nights that seemed to last forever? History often remembers Rome for its victories, its mighty legions, and its vast empire stretching across continents. But some of its greatest battles were fought without an opposing army in sight. The harsh winters of the north challenged every soldier with freezing winds, empty storehouses, sickness, and endless endurance. Surviving these brutal months demanded as much courage as any battlefield. Tonight, we journey beyond the famous triumphs of Rome to uncover a quieter story, one of resilience, determination, and the extraordinary will to survive when winter became the empire's greatest enemy. For centuries, the Roman world revolved around the warm embrace of the Mediterranean. Its soldiers were accustomed to long, sunlit summers, gentle winters, fertile valleys, and vineyards stretching across rolling hills. Italy's climate shaped everything from the crops that fed its people to the armor worn by its legions. Snow was not entirely unknown, but for most Romans, it was a fleeting visitor that disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Beyond the Alps, however, another world awaited. As the Roman Republic expanded northward during the campaigns of Julius Caesar in Gaul, and later into Germania and Britannia under the empire, the legions encountered landscapes unlike anything they had known before. Endless forests blocked out the sun. Rivers froze into solid sheets of ice. Marshes became frozen wastelands, while cold winds swept across open plains with astonishing force. The farther north they marched, the shorter the days became. Autumn faded quickly into winter, and winter lingered far longer than any Roman expected. Morning frost covered shields before sunrise. Leather sandals stiffened in the cold. Campfires burned constantly, yet never seemed warm enough. Soldiers who had grown up beneath the bright skies of Italy suddenly found themselves waking beneath grey clouds, surrounded by silence broken only by the sound of icy winds moving through towering pine trees. Many ancient writers describe the northern frontier as a land that seemed almost hostile to human life. To Romans arriving for the first time, snow-covered forests appeared endless, hiding dangers that could not be seen. Thick fog rolled across valleys, while frozen rivers created both opportunities and deadly traps. One wrong step onto thin ice could end a soldier's life before he ever met an enemy. Britannia presented its own challenges. Cold rain soaked clothing for days without stopping, while damp winds crept through wool cloaks and into the bones. Germania, meanwhile, brought harsher extremes. Heavy snow buried roads, making supply wagons almost impossible to move. Horses struggled to find footing, and entire columns slowed to a crawl as they carved paths through deep drifts. The Romans quickly realized that they were fighting two battles at once. One was against tribes who knew every forest, every hill, and every frozen river. The other was against nature itself, a relentless enemy that never grew tired, never negotiated, and never showed mercy. Generals soon understood that courage alone would not keep an army alive. Victory meant little if soldiers froze before reaching the battlefield. Roads had to remain open, food had to be stored months in advance, and forts had to become shelters strong enough to withstand months of bitter cold. Survival demanded planning, discipline, and adaptability on a scale the Roman army had never before experienced. In these frozen lands, the empire discovered a truth that would shape centuries of frontier warfare. The greatest obstacle was not always the enemy waiting beyond the trees. Sometimes, it was the winter waiting all around them. When a Roman legion marched across Italy, the roads were familiar. Stone-paved highways stretched for miles, connecting cities, forts, and ports with remarkable precision. The weather was usually predictable, and every soldier knew the rhythm of the land beneath his feet. The northern frontier was nothing like home. Winter transformed every road into an uncertain path. Fresh snow concealed rocks, tree roots, and frozen streams. Trails that had been easy to follow during summer disappeared beneath thick white drifts. Even experienced guides sometimes struggled to recognize landmarks hidden beneath ice and snow. Yet the march never stopped. A Roman legionary was expected to carry nearly everything he needed to survive. Historians estimate that the average soldier marched with more than 30 kilograms of equipment. His load included weapons, armor, a shield, several days of rations, cooking utensils, digging tools, spare clothing, and personal belongings. Roman soldiers became so famous for carrying these heavy burdens that they earned the nickname Marius Mules, a testament to their incredible endurance. Each step through deep snow demanded far more energy than marching across dry ground. The weight of iron armor pressed heavily against tired shoulders. Every breath produced small clouds of white vapor that disappeared into the freezing air. Muscles stiffened as temperatures fell lower, while fingers gradually lost their feeling despite thick woolen gloves. Even lifting a shield seemed heavier after hours of walking through snowdrifts that reached almost to the knees. Footwear presented another challenge. Roman legionaries wore sturdy military sandals known as caligae. These famous boots featured thick leather soles reinforced with hundreds of iron hobnails. On dry roads and rough mountain paths, the design provided excellent durability and traction. The hobnails gripped dirt and stone while allowing water to drain away, making them ideal for the Mediterranean climate. But winter in the north exposed their greatest weakness. Leather offered little protection against deep snow. Ice crept between the open sections of the sandals, numbing the soldiers' feet hour after hour. Melted snow soaked their socks before freezing again as temperatures dropped. Every step became colder than the last. The iron hobnails that worked so well on stone roads could become dangerously slippery on smooth ice. A single careless step might send a fully armored soldier crashing to the frozen ground. Rising again while carrying more than 30 kilograms of equipment was exhausting, and serious injuries were common. A twisted ankle or broken wrist could remove a soldier from the march long before an enemy was ever encountered. The dangers did not end with snow-covered roads. Rivers presented one of winter's greatest uncertainties. During the warmer months, Roman engineers excelled at constructing bridges or finding safe places to ford a river. In winter, however, the landscape became unpredictable. Rivers that had once flowed swiftly now appeared perfectly still beneath a layer of ice. At first glance, they looked solid enough to support an entire army. Sometimes they were, sometimes they were not. The surface might appear thick and strong, only to conceal dangerously thin ice beneath fresh snow. Soldiers had no modern tools to measure its strength. Instead, they relied on experience, observation, and the judgment of local guides. Even then, mistakes happened. Imagine the silence as the first ranks cautiously stepped onto a frozen river. The ice groaned beneath hundreds of iron-shod boots. Every man listened. Every man hoped. Then, without warning, a sharp crack echoed across the frozen surface. A section of ice collapsed, swallowing men, shields, and equipment into water so cold that breathing became almost impossible. Heavy armor dragged soldiers downward immediately. Companions rushed forward with ropes, spears, or branches, desperately trying to pull them free before the freezing current claimed them forever. Those who survived the icy water faced another battle. Clothes froze solid within minutes. Boots hardened into blocks of ice. Fingers lost all feeling, making it impossible to grip a sword, or even fasten a cloak. Unless a fire could be built quickly, the cold itself might finish what the river had begun. For Roman commanders, winter marches demanded more than courage. They required careful planning, constant discipline, and an understanding that nature could destroy an army far more efficiently than any enemy ambush. The pace slowed, scouts became even more important, and every decision carried greater consequences. With every frozen mile, the legions learned a humbling lesson. Against snow, ice, and bitter winds, victory was measured not in conquered territory, but in how many soldiers reached the next fortress alive. As daylight slowly faded behind the snow-covered forests, the Roman army faced a decision that would surprise many people today. They did not simply stop marching, gather around a fire, and sleep beneath the stars. Instead, they began building an entire military camp. No matter how exhausting the day's march had been, no matter how deep the snow or how bitter the cold, Roman discipline demanded the same routine. Every evening, almost without exception, the legion transformed an empty field into a fortified settlement. It was a habit practiced thousands of times, and one that often meant the difference between life and death. To an outsider, it might have seemed almost unbelievable. Imagine marching for more than 20 kilometers through snow while carrying over 30 kilograms of equipment. Your boots are soaked. Your shoulders ache beneath the weight of your armor. Your fingers are stiff from the cold, and the winter sun has already begun disappearing below the horizon. Most people would collapse from exhaustion. The Romans reached for their shovels. Before a single tent was raised, soldiers spread across the chosen ground with remarkable precision. Officers selected the location carefully, searching for terrain that could be defended while remaining close to fresh water and firewood whenever possible. Even in winter, these priorities rarely changed. The first task was digging a defensive ditch. Using iron spades and mattocks, legionaries cut into frozen earth that had become as hard as stone. The work was slow and punishing. Every strike sent vibrations through cold hands already numb from the freezing air. In some places the ground resisted every blow, forcing soldiers to chip away at ice before they could reach the soil beneath. Yet the ditch had to be completed. The excavated earth was piled immediately behind it, creating a raised embankment. This earthen wall formed the first line of defense against surprise attacks, giving defenders a higher position while slowing any enemy attempting to reach the camp. Next came the wooden stakes. Each legionary carried sharpened wooden stakes as part of his marching equipment. These were not decorative additions or optional supplies. They were essential tools of survival. One by one, the stakes were driven into the top of the earthen rampart. forming a sturdy wooden barrier surrounding the camp. In winter, driving them into frozen ground required tremendous effort. Heavy wooden mallets echoed through the evening as hundreds of soldiers worked together, transforming an open field into a fortress before darkness fully arrived. What had been an empty, snowy plain only a few hours earlier gradually became something entirely different: a Roman camp. Its design was astonishingly standardized. Whether the legion was stationed in sunny Spain, the deserts of the east, or the frozen frontiers of Germania, the basic layout remained almost identical. Straits divided the camp into neat sections. Gates faced carefully chosen directions. Officers occupied designated areas near the center, while each cohort knew exactly where its tents belonged. This consistency was no accident. Every soldier could find his place even in darkness or during a blizzard. There was no confusion, no wasted movement, and no arguments about where supplies should be stored or where sentries should stand. The familiar layout created order in places where nature offered only chaos. For men living far from home, that sense of order carried enormous psychological value. After spending an entire day crossing frozen rivers and snow-covered forests, returning each evening to a camp arranged exactly like the one from the previous night provided reassurance. The walls, streets, gates, and tents reminded every legionary that although the wilderness beyond remained hostile, Roman discipline still ruled within the camp. The fortifications also served another crucial purpose. Winter nights were long. Darkness arrived early and lingered for many hours. Enemy warriors who knew the forests could move silently between the trees, using snow and shadows to conceal their approach. Without strong defenses, exhausted soldiers would have remained vulnerable while sleeping. The ditch slowed attackers. The earthen wall forced them uphill. The sharpened stakes broke their formations before they could reach the tents. Meanwhile, sentries watched from elevated positions, listening carefully to every sound carried by the icy wind. Inside the camp, life continued according to strict routines. Fires were lit for warmth and cooking. Wet clothing was dried whenever possible. Armor and weapons were inspected before being carefully placed nearby for immediate use. Horses received fodder before many soldiers even ate their own evening meal. Guards rotated throughout the freezing night, ensuring that every section of the perimeter remained protected until dawn. The camp also created a barrier against the weather itself. The walls helped reduce the force of cold winds sweeping across open ground. Tents, arranged close together, trapped a small amount of warmth. Supplies remained organized and protected from drifting snow. Medical care, however limited by ancient standards, could be given more effectively within an orderly enclosure than in the open wilderness. Perhaps most importantly, the nightly construction reminded every soldier that survival depended not on individual strength, but on collective discipline. No single man could build a Roman camp alone. It existed only because thousands worked together with remarkable efficiency, each performing his assigned task without hesitation. Digging, carrying earth, placing stakes, erecting tents, lighting fires, standing guard, every action supported the next. To many enemies, the Roman camp appeared almost magical. An army would arrive before sunset, and by nightfall an impressive fortress stood where there had been nothing but empty ground. By sunrise, the camp came alive with disciplined activity. Then, when the legion marched onward, the entire settlement disappeared, leaving behind only the outlines of ditches in the snow. This extraordinary routine became one of Rome's greatest military advantages. Its walls protected soldiers not only from hostile tribes, but from fear, confusion, and the unforgiving northern winter itself. Every evening's labor increased the chances that when the next frozen dawn arrived, another legion would still be standing ready to continue its long march into the unknown. As autumn gave way to winter, the Roman army understood that endless marching was no longer possible. Snow deepened across the northern frontier, rivers froze, and the days became shorter with every passing week. Campaigns slowed, supply lines became increasingly difficult to maintain, and even the most disciplined legions accepted an unavoidable truth. Winter demanded a different kind of strategy. Instead of pushing deeper into hostile territory, many Roman units settled into carefully prepared winter quarters known as hiberna. These were far more than temporary camps. They were permanent or semi-permanent military communities, designed to shelter thousands of soldiers until spring returned. To the Romans, surviving the winter was every bit as important as winning the previous summer's campaign. From the outside, a winter fortress looked imposing. Thick stone walls rose above the snowy landscape, reinforced with watchtowers that overlooked the surrounding countryside. Wooden gates, strengthened with iron fittings, stood firmly closed against the freezing wind. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, rising into the pale winter sky, a welcome sign of warmth behind solid defenses. Beyond those walls lay an entire world built for endurance. Unlike the leather tents used during campaigns, winter forts were constructed from timber and stone. Their buildings were designed to withstand months of freezing temperatures, heavy snowfall, and relentless northern storms. The walls retained precious warmth, while sturdy roofs carried the weight of accumulated snow without collapsing. Crossing through the main gate, a visitor would immediately notice something familiar. Just like the marching camps built every evening, the winter fortress followed an organized plan. Straight roads crossed the fort from north to south and east to west, dividing the settlement into neat sections. Every building had its purpose, every street its destination, and every soldier knew exactly where he belonged. Order remained one of Rome's greatest weapons. The heart of the fortress was the barracks. These long rectangular buildings housed the ordinary legionaries. Inside, soldiers slept together in shared rooms rather than private quarters. A small group of men, often those who had marched and fought side by side for years, occupied each space. Their beds were simple wooden platforms covered with straw mattresses, thick blankets, and animal skins whenever available. Privacy was almost non-existent, yet companionship mattered far more. During the long winter nights, these rooms became places where stories were shared, equipment was repaired, letters were written, and friendships were strengthened. Veterans passed their knowledge to younger recruits, while laughter occasionally echoed through the barracks, despite the harsh conditions outside. In a land far from home, these shared rooms became a second family. Nearby stood one of the busiest buildings in the fortress, the kitchen. Feeding an entire legion was a daily challenge. Large ovens baked bread in enormous quantities, while iron cauldrons simmered over open fires from morning until night. Soldiers prepared hearty meals using wheat, barley, beans, lentils, preserved meat, cheese, onions, and whatever fresh supplies local merchants or hunting parties could provide. Hot food meant more than comfort. It restored energy lost during hours spent standing guard in freezing temperatures. Warm soup could raise morale after a day of clearing snow from walls or repairing frozen roads. Even a simple loaf of fresh bread carried tremendous psychological value, reminding soldiers that life continued despite the endless winter beyond the gates. Equally important was the granary. These storage buildings were among the most carefully protected structures inside every fortress. Raised above the ground to reduce dampness and designed with excellent ventilation, They safeguarded thousands of kilograms of grain against moisture, mold, and rodents. Every sack of wheat represented survival. If supplies ran out before spring, no amount of courage or military skill could save the garrison. Roman commanders carefully calculated food reserves months in advance, knowing that heavy snowfall or hostile raids might prevent supply wagons from reaching the frontier for weeks. Winter rewarded preparation and punished carelessness. Not far from the granaries stood the stables. Roman cavalry horses required almost as much attention as the soldiers themselves. The animals were sheltered from icy winds, fed carefully measured rations of hay and grain, and groomed daily despite the cold. Stable workers checked their hooves for cracks caused by frozen ground and ensured that saddles and harnesses remained in good condition. A healthy horse could carry messages, patrol the frontier, or pursue raiders once the weather improved. Losing cavalry mounts during winter weakened the entire fortress. Another building rarely celebrated in history, yet absolutely essential, was the workshop. Here, skilled craftsmen worked throughout the winter months repairing the tools that kept the Roman army functioning. Blacksmiths reheated bent sword blades, replaced damaged spearheads, and forged countless iron nails. Armorers repaired dented helmets and broken chain mail. Carpenters crafted replacement shields, strengthened wagon wheels, repaired doors, and fashioned furniture for the barracks. Nothing useful was wasted. A cracked shield might receive a new wooden frame. A broken spear could become firewood only after every reusable piece of iron had been recovered. Leather workers patched worn boots, repaired belts, and stitched together cloaks damaged by months of snow and rain. The workshop ensured that when spring finally arrived, the legion would be ready to march again. Life inside the winter fortress followed a steady rhythm. Guards rotated along the walls. Fires burned continuously. Smoke curled from chimneys while snow gathered silently on rooftops. Officers planned future campaigns, engineers inspected the defenses, and ordinary soldiers balanced daily duties with moments of much-needed rest. Outside the walls, winter remained relentless. The forest stood silent beneath thick snow. Wolves wandered through the darkness. Frozen rivers glistened beneath the moonlight, and bitter winds swept across the frontier without mercy. But inside the Hibernia, Rome had carved out a small island of order in a frozen wilderness. Stone by stone, beam by beam, and day by day, these winter fortresses allowed an empire born beneath the Mediterranean sun to survive in lands where winter itself seemed determined to drive every outsider away. They were not merely places to wait for spring. They were the foundations upon which Rome held its northern frontier for generations. As the long winter nights settled over the Roman frontier, darkness arrived long before most soldiers were ready for sleep. The sun disappeared behind snow-covered hills during the late afternoon, leaving behind a world illuminated only by flickering firelight, and the pale glow of the moon reflecting across frozen ground. The temperature continued to fall. The cold seeped into stone walls, wooden doors, iron weapons, and every corner of the fortress. Outside, icy winds swept across the battlements, carrying fine snow through every crack they could find. Inside, the soldiers faced a challenge that every Roman on the frontier understood. How do you survive a northern winter without modern heating? There were no radiators warming the barracks, no electric blankets, no insulated windows. Every degree of warmth had to be created, protected, and shared. The first line of defense was clothing. A Roman legionary did not simply rely on his armor. During winter, soldiers wore several layers beneath their equipment. Wool was their greatest ally. Thick woolen tunics trapped body heat surprisingly well, even in damp conditions. Over these came heavy wool cloaks, known throughout the Roman world for their practicality. These cloaks became far more than military garments. By day, they shielded soldiers from freezing winds while standing guard on the walls. During long marches, they helped preserve precious body heat. At night, they served as additional blankets, wrapped tightly around sleeping men who hoped to keep the cold from reaching their skin. Wool was valuable because it continued to provide insulation even when slightly wet, an important advantage in regions where melting snow and freezing rain were constant companions. Still, wool alone was not always enough. In the coldest provinces, many soldiers also relied upon animal furs. Sheepskins, goatskins, wolf pelts, and deer hides offered another layer of protection against the relentless winter air. Officers with greater resources sometimes possessed thicker, better quality furs, but even ordinary legionaries understood the value of any additional insulation they could obtain. Nothing that produced warmth was considered unimportant. Inside the fortress, fires rarely went out completely. Large hearths burned throughout the day, becoming the heart of every building. Around them soldiers cooked meals, dried wet clothing, repaired equipment, and shared stories while escaping the bitter cold outside. The dancing flames provided more than physical comfort. They created light, companionship, and a welcome reminder of civilization in an otherwise hostile wilderness. Keeping those fires alive required constant effort. Charcoal became one of the most valuable resources in winter. Unlike freshly cut wood, properly prepared charcoal burned hotter, produced less smoke, and lasted much longer. Roman supply officers carefully managed its use, ensuring enough fuel remained to carry the garrison through months of freezing weather. Wagon loads of wood were gathered before winter arrived, then converted into charcoal whenever possible. Every piece of fuel mattered. A wasted fire today might mean a freezing night several weeks later. Even so, heating an entire stone fortress was impossible. The Romans instead concentrated warmth where it was needed most. Kitchen buildings often became some of the warmest places inside the camp. Massive ovens baked bread almost continuously, while great iron cauldrons simmered with soup and porridge over open flames. Heat poured into the surrounding rooms, warming nearby walls and filling the air with the comforting scent of fresh bread and cooked grain. Many daily tasks naturally drifted toward these warmer spaces. Armor was polished beside the fire. Boots were dried carefully after snowy patrols. Letters were written while hands absorbed precious warmth from nearby flames. For a few hours each evening, the kitchen became more than a place to prepare food. It became the social heart of the fortress. The Romans also understood something that modern science fully confirms. The human body itself produces heat. Sleeping arrangements reflected this practical knowledge. Rather than spreading soldiers far apart, legionaries slept close together inside shared barracks. Several men occupied the same room, their beds positioned side by side. Thick wool blankets covered each sleeping place, while additional cloaks and animal skins were layered over the top. As dozens of men rested beneath one roof, their combined body heat slowly warmed the enclosed space. The room never became truly comfortable, but it became survivable. Veterans learned small habits that helped preserve warmth through the night. Dry clothing was treasured. Wet boots were removed whenever possible and placed near, but never too close to the fire. Blankets were tucked tightly around the body to reduce drafts. Cloaks often covered both shoulders and head, leaving only a small opening for breathing. Simple habits, repeated every evening, could mean the difference between restful sleep and dangerous exposure. Guard duty remained the hardest challenge. No matter how warm the barracks became, someone always had to stand watch. Throughout the night, sentries climbed the fortress walls, while snow drifted silently across the towers. Wrapped in heavy cloaks, they stamped their feet to restore circulation and flexed their fingers around spear shafts, growing colder with every passing hour. Fellow soldiers relieved them at regular intervals, preventing one man from remaining exposed for too long. This constant rotation protected not only the fortress, but the guards themselves. No soldier was expected to face the northern winter alone. Even with all these precautions, winter still claimed victims. Frostbite, though not understood by modern medical terms, could permanently damage fingers, toes, ears, and noses. Men who remained wet for too long often developed dangerous illnesses. Smoke from indoor fires irritated lungs and eyes, while poorly ventilated rooms sometimes filled with harmful fumes. Every winter tested the limits of Roman endurance. Yet year after year, the legions adapted. They learned which fabrics held warmth longest. They discovered how to store fuel more efficiently. Engineers improved buildings, commanders refined routines, and experienced veterans passed practical knowledge to every new recruit arriving from the warmer provinces of the empire. This willingness to learn became one of Rome's greatest strengths. The empire had been born beneath the mild skies of the Mediterranean, but it refused to remain a southern civilization. Instead of retreating before snow and ice, the Romans slowly mastered the art of living within them. Warmth did not come from sophisticated technology. It came from preparation, from discipline, from shared fires, carefully stored charcoal, thick wool cloaks, sturdy stone buildings, and the quiet understanding that survival depended upon thousands of small decisions made every single day. On the frozen frontiers of the empire, winter never became easy. But through patience, ingenuity, and remarkable organization, Rome learned how to endure it, and in doing so, ensured that its northern fortresses remained standing long after the first snowfall covered the land. For every Roman soldier stationed on the empire's frozen frontiers, survival depended on far more than swords, shields, or strong walls. A fortress could withstand an enemy attack. Thick wool cloaks could slow the bitter cold. But without food, even the greatest legion in the world would eventually collapse. Winter was a battle of endurance. As snow-buried roads and frozen rivers cut off supply routes, every meal became part of Rome's carefully planned strategy for survival. Long before the first snowfall arrived, quartermasters calculated exactly how much food each garrison would need to last through the coming months. Warehouses filled with sacks of grain, barrels of preserved meat, wheels of cheese, and countless other supplies that would keep thousands of men alive until spring. At the center of every Roman diet stood one simple ingredient: wheat. To the Romans, wheat was more than food. It was the foundation of military life. Every legionary received regular grain rations, often carrying several days' worth during campaigns. Inside the winter fortress, enormous stores of wheat were protected more carefully than almost any other resource. Each morning, the familiar sound of hand mills echoed through the barracks. Soldiers took turns grinding hard wheat kernels into coarse flour using heavy stone querns. The work required patience and strength, but it connected every man directly to his next meal. Unlike modern armies supplied with ready-made food, Roman soldiers frequently prepared much of their own daily ration. The flour became many things. Most commonly it became porridge. Simple, warm, and filling, wheat porridge was one of the most reliable meals a Roman soldier could hope for during the long northern winter. Mixed with water and slowly cooked over a fire, it required few ingredients yet provided valuable energy for hours of hard labor. A steaming bowl of porridge before dawn could make the difference between enduring a freezing patrol and collapsing from exhaustion. It was not luxurious. It was not exciting, but it was dependable. Bread followed close behind. Throughout the fortress, large ovens burned almost continuously. Bakers worked before sunrise, shaping coarse loaves that would feed hundreds of hungry soldiers every day. Fresh bread carried a comforting aroma that drifted through the streets of the camp, reminding everyone that despite the harsh conditions outside, life within the walls continued according to familiar routines. Bread also traveled well. Hard loaves could be carried during patrols or distributed to soldiers guarding distant watchtowers. Even after several days, they remained nourishing enough to sustain men working in freezing temperatures. Yet bread alone could not meet every need. Salt played a surprisingly important role in the Roman military diet. Today it sits quietly on dining tables around the world, but in ancient times salt was one of the empire's most valuable resources. It preserved food, enhanced flavor, and helped maintain supplies throughout the winter. Roman officials carefully transported and stored large quantities because they understood its importance. Without salt, winter provisions would spoil long before spring. Salted meats became one of the garrison's greatest treasures. Fresh meat was difficult to obtain once snow covered the countryside. Hunting remained possible, but success could never be guaranteed. Instead, much of the fortress depended upon pork that had been salted, smoked, or cured months earlier. Thick strips of smoked bacon hung from wooden beams inside cool storage rooms. Although tougher than fresh meat, they lasted for months and provided valuable fat and protein during the coldest season of the year. Small portions were often added to soups or porridge, transforming otherwise simple meals into something richer and far more satisfying. Fat was especially valuable. The freezing climate demanded enormous amounts of energy from every soldier. Standing guard through icy nights, shoveling snow, repairing walls, or marching across frozen landscapes burned countless calories. Foods rich in fat helped replace that energy far better than grain alone. Cheese offered another dependable source of nutrition. Unlike fresh milk, which spoiled quickly, hard cheeses could survive long journeys and lengthy storage. Wheels of cheese filled storerooms alongside sacks of wheat, ready to be sliced into daily rations. It required no cooking, traveled easily, and supplied both protein and fat qualities every Roman quartermaster appreciated. A piece of bread, a slice of cheese, and a small portion of smoked pork could sustain a soldier through hours of demanding work. To modern eyes, the meal might appear remarkably simple. To the Romans, it represented careful planning and efficient logistics. No discussion of Roman food would be complete without mentioning wine. Contrary to popular imagination, soldiers rarely drank strong wine by itself during ordinary military life. Instead, it was commonly mixed with water. This diluted drink was safer than consuming untreated water in many locations, and provided a familiar taste that reminded soldiers of home. Warm wine mixed with hot water became especially welcome during winter evenings. After hours spent outside in freezing temperatures, holding a warm cup between cold hands offered comfort beyond its nutritional value. Around the fire, conversation flowed more easily as men shared stories from Italy, Gaul, Hispania, or distant provinces scattered across the empire. Meals nourished more than the body. They strengthened morale. Winter food required constant preparation months before the cold ever arrived. Granaries had to be filled. Meat had to be salted and smoked. Cheese had to be aged. Firewood had to be gathered. Barrels, sacks, and storage rooms required careful inspection to keep moisture, rodents, and mold from destroying precious supplies. Every successful winter was one long before winter began. Experienced commanders understood this lesson well. A poorly supplied fortress might possess strong walls and brave soldiers, yet hunger could accomplish what enemy armies never could. By contrast, a well-stocked garrison could withstand isolation for months, patiently waiting for the return of warmer weather. As snow continued to fall outside the fortress walls, kitchens remained busy from dawn until dusk. The scent of fresh bread mingled with wood smoke. Great cauldrons of porridge simmered over glowing fires. Soldiers carried loaves beneath their cloaks, shared pieces of smoked bacon with trusted friends, and quietly thanked the foresight of those who had prepared these stores long before the first frost appeared. In the end, Rome's northern frontier was sustained not only by discipline or engineering, but by the humble foods that arrived on every soldier's table. Wheat, bread, salt, smoked meat, cheese, and watered wine were never celebrated in triumphal parades, yet they quietly accomplished something extraordinary. They kept an empire alive through the longest, coldest winters imaginable. At first glance, winter seemed to solve one of humanity's oldest problems. Water was everywhere. Snow covered the forests, the roads, and the rooftops of every Roman fortress. Frozen rivers stretched across the landscape like white highways, while lakes disappeared beneath thick sheets of ice. To a traveler unfamiliar with the northern frontier, it might have appeared that drinking water would never be scarce. The reality was very different. For Roman soldiers, finding safe water during winter required knowledge, patience, and discipline. One careless decision could weaken an entire garrison long before an enemy appeared. The most obvious solution was snow itself, yet experienced soldiers knew that eating snow directly was a mistake. A handful of fresh snow might seem refreshing after hours of marching, but it did little to satisfy thirst. Snow contains surprisingly little water by volume, meaning a soldier would need to consume enormous amounts just to replace the fluids lost through hard work. More importantly, the freezing snow rapidly lowered body temperature. Every mouthful forced the body to spend precious energy warming it before it could be absorbed. For men already struggling against icy winds and sub-zero temperatures, this unnecessary loss of heat could become dangerous. Veterans warned younger recruits to resist the temptation, no matter how thirsty they became during long patrols. Instead, snow had to be melted. Inside the fortress, great iron cauldrons often hung above open fires from dawn until late evening. Snow collected in wooden baskets was poured into these pots, where it slowly transformed into liquid water. The process demanded an astonishing amount of snow. Entire baskets would melt into only a few small buckets of water. It was slow work, but it was far safer. The fires that warmed the barracks also made drinking water available throughout the winter. Boiling served another important purpose. Although the Romans did not understand bacteria or viruses as modern science does, centuries of practical experience had taught them valuable lessons. Water that had been heated was often safer to drink than water taken directly from uncertain sources. Boiling also removed the bitter chill, allowing soldiers to drink without further lowering their body temperature. Warm water became a quiet comfort on freezing mornings. Many fortresses were built near reliable wells. Choosing the location of a permanent camp was never accidental. Roman engineers carefully considered access to fresh water before construction even began. A dependable well provided one of the safest sources of drinking water throughout the year, protected from many of the dangers affecting rivers and streams. Even during winter, wells remained vital. Drawing water became part of the daily routine. Soldiers lowered wooden buckets into the darkness, listening for the familiar splash far below. The water was cold enough to numb bare hands within seconds, but it flowed even when much of the surrounding countryside lay frozen. A good well could sustain thousands of men for months. Natural springs offered another valuable source. Unlike still water trapped beneath frozen lakes, springs continued to move. Their constant flow often prevented complete freezing, even during the harshest weather. Scouts regularly identified nearby springs before selecting campsites, knowing that moving water was usually cleaner and more reliable than stagnant pools. Some springs even released slightly warmer groundwater, creating patches where snow melted despite the surrounding cold. To Roman soldiers, such places were precious gifts from nature. Streams also remained useful, although they demanded greater caution. Fast-moving water froze more slowly than quiet rivers, but snow could hide dangerous currents beneath thin ice. Soldiers collecting water approached carefully, breaking the surface only where they believed the ice remained strong enough to support them. A single mistake could prove fatal. The greatest uncertainty came from frozen lakes. From a distance they appeared peaceful, smooth, solid. Yet appearances often deceived. Ice thickness varied enormously. One section might support dozens of men, while another concealed dangerously thin layers, weakened by underwater currents or natural springs. Roman engineers learned to test frozen surfaces carefully before allowing wagons, horses, or groups of soldiers to cross. Even when the ice proved safe, collecting water required effort. Workers chopped through the frozen surface with axes and iron picks, creating holes large enough to lower buckets beneath the ice. The work was exhausting. Chips of ice scattered across the snow while freezing wind quickly coated tools with frost. Every bucket brought back represented another day of survival, but obtaining water was only half the challenge. Keeping it clean proved equally important. The Romans did not possess microscopes or understand invisible organisms, yet they clearly recognized that polluted water often led to sickness. Military discipline therefore extended to sanitation. Latrines were carefully placed away from wells and drinking supplies. Waste disposal followed strict routines, reducing the risk that contaminated runoff would reach important water sources. These rules were not based upon scientific theory. They were based upon painful experience. Entire groups of soldiers could become weakened by stomach illnesses if water became contaminated. Severe diarrhea and vomiting robbed the body of precious fluids at exactly the time when every soldier needed strength to endure the winter. In isolated frontier forts, where medical care remained limited and resupply uncertain, disease sometimes threatened more lives than enemy attacks. Roman commanders understood a simple truth. An army too sick to stand could not defend the frontier. Water therefore became part of military logistics, just like food, firewood, or weapons. Wells required maintenance. Buckets had to be repaired. Fires needed constant fuel for melting snow and boiling water. Guards protected important water sources just as carefully as granaries. Every drop mattered. As evening settled over the winter fortress, smoke drifted lazily from stone chimneys while soldiers gathered around glowing hearths. Iron pots simmered quietly above the flames. Some contained porridge. Others warmed water collected from wells, springs, or freshly melted snow. Outside, the frozen landscape seemed silent and lifeless. Inside, every cup of warm water represented careful planning, discipline, and countless hours of labor. It reminded every legionary that survival on Rome's northern frontier depended not upon dramatic victories, but upon mastering the simplest necessities of life. For in a world buried beneath snow and ice, even a drink of clean, warm water became one of the empire's greatest treasures. When most people imagine a Roman soldier, They picture polished armor gleaming beneath the Mediterranean sun. A bright red tunic hangs beneath a coat of iron mail, while sturdy leather sandals strike the stones of a Roman road. It is an image that has appeared in countless paintings, films, and history books. But that image belonged to another world. On the empire's northern frontier, where winter could last for months and temperatures often fell far below freezing, the familiar appearance of a Roman legionary changed dramatically. The army that had conquered warm Mediterranean lands proved remarkably adaptable, gradually abandoning certain traditions in favor of whatever would keep its soldiers alive. Survival mattered more than appearance. The first secret was layering. Rather than relying on a single heavy garment, Roman soldiers wore multiple layers of wool clothing beneath their armor. A soft woolen tunic rested closest to the skin, helping trap body heat while absorbing moisture produced during long marches. Over this came additional garments, followed by the famous military cloak that shielded the body from biting winds. Each layer trapped a thin pocket of warm air. Together these layers create far better insulation than one thick garment alone. Modern outdoor clothing still relies upon exactly the same principle, proving that Roman experience had taught them lessons that remain useful even today. The heavy wool cloak remained one of the most valuable possessions a frontier soldier owned. During the day, it protected him from snow, rain, and freezing winds sweeping across open ground. At night, the same cloak became an extra blanket. When standing guard atop icy walls, soldiers wrapped it tightly around their shoulders, leaving only their eyes exposed to the winter air. It served as clothing. It served as bedding. Sometimes, it even served as a temporary shelter while resting during long marches. Perhaps one of the greatest changes came below the waist. Traditional Roman fashion favored short tunics that left much of the legs exposed. Trousers, known to the Romans as braccae, were once viewed as distinctly foreign garments, commonly associated with Celtic and Germanic tribes living beyond the empire. Many Romans even considered them uncivilized. Winter quickly changed those opinions. On the northern frontier, practicality defeated pride. Archaeological discoveries and historical evidence suggest that Roman soldiers stationed in Britain, Germania, and other cold provinces increasingly adopted long trousers for warmth. Whether issued officially or acquired through local trade, these garments protected the legs from freezing winds and deep snow in ways that traditional clothing simply could not. The empire had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the best ideas came from the very people had once dismissed. Hands required equal protection. A soldier unable to grip his spear or sword because of numb fingers was no longer an effective defender. Although gloves are rarely mentioned in popular portrayals of Roman armies, evidence suggests that mittens and gloves made from wool or leather were used in the colder provinces. Simple though they were, they preserved dexterity during patrols and construction work. Imagine standing atop a fortress wall before sunrise. The wind blows relentlessly across the battlements. An iron spear grows colder with every passing minute. Without some protection, bare fingers would quickly lose their strength. Warm hands meant a ready soldier. Feet demanded even greater attention. Roman sandals, the famous caligae, had served the legions well across much of Europe. Their thick leather soles and iron hobnails provided excellent traction on dry roads, but deep snow revealed their limitations. Cold air entered through the open sections. Snow melted inside before freezing once again. Marching became painful. To solve this problem, soldiers added thick wool socks beneath their footwear. Some wrapped strips of cloth around their feet before putting on their sandals, creating additional insulation. Others modified existing boots or adopted enclosed footwear better suited to the northern climate. Archaeological finds from Roman Britain suggest that footwear gradually evolved as the army adapted to colder conditions. More enclosed boots appeared alongside traditional military sandals, offering greater protection against snow, mud, and freezing temperatures. The Romans were practical engineers. If a design no longer served its purpose, they improved it. Protecting the head was equally important. A surprising amount of body heat escapes through the head and neck, something Roman soldiers understood through experience if not scientific measurement. Woolen hoods became common during winter, covering the ear's neck, and much of the face while fitting comfortably beneath or alongside military helmets whenever possible. The difference could be remarkable. A simple hood blocked icy winds that might otherwise make hours of guard duty almost unbearable. Some soldiers also wrapped scarves or strips of cloth around their necks and lower faces, reducing exposure to freezing air while breathing. None of these garments appeared particularly impressive. There were no elaborate decorations, no polished bronze ornaments, no brilliant colors designed for triumphal parades. Instead, winter clothing reflected the quiet reality of frontier life. Everything existed for one purpose: to preserve warmth, to keep muscles working, to allow another day of marching, building, or standing watch. By the end of every winter, these garments showed the marks of hard service. Cloaks became stained with smoke from countless campfires. Wool socks required constant mending. Leather boots cracked from repeated freezing and thawing. Gloves wore thin where fingers gripped tools and weapons every day. The fortress workshops rarely stood empty. Leather workers repaired torn boots. Tailors patched worn cloaks. Needles moved steadily through thick wool by the light of flickering oil lamps, ensuring every soldier remained prepared for whatever the next snowstorm might bring. Looking across a Roman frontier fortress in midwinter, one would hardly recognize the gleaming army often celebrated in imperial monuments. Instead, the soldiers appeared wrapped in layers of wool, heavy cloaks, sturdy boots, fur-lined garments, and practical hoods. They looked less like conquerors from the warm Mediterranean and more like men who had learned to live in the frozen north. Perhaps that was Rome's greatest strength. It was not merely an empire that conquered distant lands. It was an empire willing to change, adapt, and learn from unfamiliar climates and cultures. On the northern frontier, victory did not belong to the strongest army alone. It belonged to the army that learned how to dress for winter. Not every enemy carried a sword. Not every danger announced itself with the sound of horns or the clash of shields. On Rome's frozen northern frontier, some of the greatest threats arrived quietly. They slipped into the fortress without warning, moving from one barracks to another, weakening soldiers long before anyone realized what was happening. Disease was the enemy that could never be seen. Even the strongest legionary, a man capable of marching dozens of kilometers through deep snow while carrying heavy armor, could suddenly find himself unable to stand. No amount of courage could defeat an illness once it had taken hold. For Roman commanders, this invisible enemy demanded just as much attention as hostile tribes beyond the walls. Winter created the perfect conditions for sickness. Cold itself does not directly cause illnesses like the common cold, but freezing weather, exhaustion, damp clothing, crowded living conditions, and poor nutrition could leave soldiers more vulnerable to infections. The Romans did not understand viruses or bacteria, yet they clearly recognized that winter often brought waves of illness. A soldier who spent hours standing guard in icy winds might return to the barracks soaked by melting snow. His cloak remained damp, His boots never completely dried. Night after night, his body struggled against cold and fatigue until eventually fever appeared. What began as a simple cough could spread rapidly through a shared sleeping room. The barracks, filled with dozens of men living closely together, offered warmth and companionship but also allowed respiratory illnesses to pass easily from one soldier to another. A sneeze, a cough, or even prolonged close contact during long winter evenings increased the likelihood that several men would soon become ill. Most eventually recovered. Some did not. Among the most dangerous illnesses was pneumonia. Without antibiotics or modern medicine, an infection deep inside the lungs could become life-threatening. Breathing grew painful. Fever burned through exhausted bodies already weakened by weeks of cold weather. Even walking across the courtyard became an enormous effort. Roman physicians could offer herbal remedies, warm drinks, rest and careful observation. Sometimes these treatments helped. Often they could do little more than provide comfort. Winter brought another danger that Roman soldiers understood all too well, even if they lacked a modern name for it. Today we call it frostbite. Hours spent exposed to freezing temperatures could permanently damage fingers, toes, ears, and noses. At first came numbness, then a strange tingling sensation. Skin gradually lost its natural color, becoming pale or gray as blood flow diminished. A soldier might ignore the warning signs while focused on his duties. By the time warmth returned, the damage had already begun. Severe frostbite sometimes left men permanently disabled, unable to march, hold weapons, or continue military service. Guard rotations therefore became more than a matter of discipline, they were a matter of survival. Officers ensured that sentries were relieved regularly, allowing frozen hands and feet time to recover beside the warmth of indoor fires. Nutrition also influenced health in ways the Romans only partially understood. Fresh fruits and vegetables became scarce throughout the long northern winter. Supplies depended heavily upon stored grain, smoked meat, cheese, and preserved foods. These kept soldiers alive remarkably well, but they could not always provide every nutrient the human body required. Months without fresh produce sometimes led to weakness, slow-wound healing, bleeding gums, or persistent fatigue symptoms we now recognize as signs of vitamin deficiencies. The Romans could observe these problems. They simply did not know their exact cause. Whenever possible, hunting, fishing, and trade with nearby communities helped diversify the winter diet, providing occasional fresh foods that improved both health and morale. Water presented another constant concern. As we have already seen, Roman engineers carefully selected reliable wells and springs, while commanders enforced strict rules governing sanitation. These precautions existed because experience had repeatedly demonstrated an important truth. Dirty water made soldiers sick. Although invisible microbes remained unknown, contaminated drinking supplies frequently caused stomach illnesses that spread rapidly through crowded fortresses. Severe diarrhea and vomiting weakened men already struggling against freezing temperatures, leaving them dangerously dehydrated. An army suffering from widespread intestinal disease could become almost incapable of defending itself. For this reason, sanitation became part of military discipline. Latrines were placed away from wells whenever possible. Waste was removed regularly. Kitchen areas were kept remarkably organized by ancient standards. Cleanliness was never perfect, but compared with many contemporary societies, Roman military camps maintained impressive levels of order. Even so, challenges remained. Winter made washing more difficult. Water froze quickly. Bathing became less frequent than during warmer months. Although many permanent forts eventually included bathhouses where heated water allowed soldiers to maintain hygiene throughout much of the year, these baths offered benefits beyond simple cleanliness. Warm water relaxed aching muscles after long marches. Steam eased breathing during cold weather. The familiar routines of bathing also provided psychological comfort, reminding soldiers that even on the edge of the known world, they remained citizens of Rome. Military doctors worked constantly throughout the winter. Known as medici, these physicians treated wounds, set broken bones, prepared herbal medicines, and cared for the sick whenever possible. Their knowledge came from generations of observation rather than modern science, yet many possessed considerable practical skill. Still, they faced limits no ancient healer could overcome. Some illnesses simply claimed lives despite every effort. As winter deepened, the greatest victories often passed unnoticed. A soldier recovering from fever, a wounded hand healing without infection, a healthy garrison reaching spring with most of its strength intact. These quiet successes rarely appeared in history books. Yet they mattered just as much as famous battles. For Rome's northern frontier was defended not only by walls, weapons, and disciplined legions, but by thousands of ordinary men who endured sickness, cold, and hardship day after day. They discovered that survival required more than courage on the battlefield. It required clean water, careful sanitation, warm shelter, nourishing food, attentive medical care, and the determination to protect one another from an enemy that could neither be seen nor fought with a sword. In the frozen silence of winter, disease remained Rome's most patient adversary, and every healthy sunrise was, in its own quiet way, another hard-earned victory. Winter had a way of slowing the world. Snow covered the roads, rivers disappeared beneath thick sheets of ice. The forests grew quiet, and military campaigns became less frequent. Weeks could pass without a single battle, and for many armies throughout history, these long periods of inactivity proved just as dangerous as combat itself. Boredom bred carelessness. Carelessness weakened discipline, and without discipline, even the strongest army could slowly fall apart. The Romans understood this better than almost anyone. To them, winter was never considered a season of rest. It was simply another phase of military life, one that demanded structure, routine, and constant purpose. Every day inside a frontier fortress followed a carefully organized schedule, ensuring that soldiers remained physically strong, mentally alert, and ready for the moment spring campaigns began again. Each morning began before sunrise. Long before daylight reached the snow-covered walls, the sound of horns echoed across the fortress. Fires were stirred back to life. Guards ending their night watches returned to the barracks while fresh sentries climbed onto the battlements. Breakfast was simple but nourishing, often consisting of bread, porridge, and watered wine before the day's duties officially began. Even in freezing temperatures, training continued. Roman commanders believed that muscles weakened quickly when left idle. Soldiers therefore practiced marching, weapon drills, shield formations, and physical exercises whenever conditions allowed. Sometimes these activities took place inside the fortress courtyard. At other times, small units marched through the surrounding snow to maintain endurance and familiarity with the local landscape. The cold made every movement more difficult. Heavy cloaks restricted motion. Frozen ground challenged balance. Breath formed thick clouds in the icy air. Yet the purpose remained clear. If a sudden attack came the middle of winter, every soldier had to respond immediately. There would be no time to regain lost strength or forgotten skills. Training preserved readiness. Night duty presented another constant responsibility. Darkness arrived early during the northern winter. stretching across the frontier for long hours. While most of the garrison slept, guards remained awake atop the walls, scanning the silent forests beyond the fortress. Their task demanded extraordinary concentration, a distant movement between snow-covered trees, an unfamiliar sound carried by the wind, the crack of ice beneath unseen footsteps. Any of these could signal approaching danger. To prevent exhaustion, commanders rotated guards regularly. No man remained exposed to the freezing weather longer than necessary. Fresh sentries replaced tired ones throughout the night, ensuring both vigilance and survival. The walls were never left unprotected. When soldiers were not training or standing guard, they often became laborers. Winter storms constantly damaged roads linking frontier forts with nearby settlements. Snowdrifts buried important routes, while repeated freezing and thawing cracked carefully constructed Roman highways. These roads represented the lifelines of the empire. Food, weapons, reinforcements, medical supplies, and official messages all depended upon them. A blocked road could isolate an entire fortress for weeks, so the soldiers repaired them. Using shovels, picks and carts, working parties cleared snow, removed fallen trees, filled damaged sections with stone, and restored drainage channels whenever weather permitted. It was exhausting work, yet every repaired road strengthened Rome's hold over the frontier. Firewood demanded equal attention. Every building inside the fortress depended upon fires for warmth, cooking and boiling water. Without a constant supply of fuel, winter life would quickly become impossible. Wood-cutting parties left the safety of the walls almost daily. Axes echoed through frozen forests as soldiers felled carefully selected trees. Logs were trimmed, stacked onto wagons or sledges, and hauled back to the fortress before nightfall. Once inside, the timber was cut into manageable pieces and stored beneath cover to remain as dry as possible. Every log represented another warm meal, another heated barracks, another chance to survive until spring. Construction never truly stopped either. Roman engineers believed that every fortress could be improved. Walls required reinforcement after harsh weather. Watchtowers needed repairs. Roofs damaged by heavy snow had to be strengthened before they collapsed. Workshops produced replacement doors, fences, bridges, and countless other structures essential for daily life. Even when no enemy threatened the frontier, the soldiers remained busy building the empire around them. This constant activity served another important purpose. It kept minds occupied. Long winters could wear heavily upon morale. Many legionaries had traveled hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from their homes. Some had not seen their families for years. Endless gray skies and freezing temperatures encouraged loneliness, homesickness, and despair. Work offered an antidote. Every completed task reminded soldiers that they remained useful, productive members of a disciplined community, rather than isolated individuals waiting for winter to end. The Roman army rarely tolerated idleness. Military discipline extended far beyond the battlefield. A soldier who neglected his assigned duties, ignored orders, abandoned his post, or repeatedly demonstrated laziness faced punishment. The severity depended upon the offense. Minor failures might result in extra labor, reduced privileges, or public reprimands before fellow soldiers. More serious acts of negligence could bring harsh physical punishment or severe military penalties. Roman commanders believed that one careless individual endangered everyone else. If a guard fell asleep, the entire fortress became vulnerable. If workers neglected road repairs, supply wagons might never arrive. If firewood was not gathered in time, hundreds of men could suffer during the coldest nights. Responsibility belonged to every soldier. This unwavering discipline became one of Rome's greatest advantages. Other armies often dissolved into inactivity during harsh winters, waiting impatiently for warmer weather. Roman legions used those same months to train harder, strengthen defenses, improve infrastructure, repair equipment, and prepare for future campaigns. By the time spring finally arrived and the snow slowly retreated from the frontier, the soldiers were not emerging from months of rest. They were emerging from months of preparation. Their weapons had been repaired, their roads restored, their bodies remained strong, their routines remained sharp. Winter had tested their patience, endurance, and determination, but had never broken their discipline. And perhaps that was Rome's greatest victory over the frozen north. The empire did not survive because its winters were easier than those faced by its enemies. It survived because its soldiers refused to let winter change who they were. Even beneath endless snow and silent skies, they remained Roman. When the day's duties were finally complete, the fortress grew quieter. The last patrol returned through the gates. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimneys as cooks extinguished the largest kitchen fires, leaving only glowing embers to warm the buildings through the long winter night. Outside, snow continued to fall across the silent frontier. Beyond the walls, darkness swallowed the forests, and the icy wind carried no sound except its own endless whisper. For the Roman soldiers, these hours were precious. They were not moments of idleness, but moments of humanity. After endless drills, construction work, guard duty, and labor in the freezing cold, every legionary needed time to rest not only his body, but also his mind. One of the simplest forms of entertainment was board games. Archaeologists have uncovered gaming boards scratched into stone floors, wooden tables, and even large paving stones inside Roman forts. Some were carefully carved, while others were little more than quick markings made with a knife during spare moments. The rules of many of these games have been lost to history, yet their purpose remains easy to understand. Gathered around a table lit by the soft glow of an oil lamp, a few soldiers could briefly forget the freezing wilderness outside. Friendly competition filled the room with laughter, teasing, and occasional arguments over clever moves. Nearby, another familiar sound echoed through the barracks. The rattle of dice. Dice games were immensely popular throughout the Roman world. Small cubes carved from bone, ivory, or wood passed from one weathered hand to another as soldiers tested both luck and skill. Sometimes they played merely for amusement. At other times, small wagers added excitement to an otherwise ordinary evening. Roman commanders occasionally frowned upon excessive gambling, but the popularity of dice never disappeared. Perhaps because chance offered something winter rarely did, a pleasant surprise. As the games slowly ended, conversation usually continued. Storytelling had always been part of military life. Veterans recounted old campaigns fought in distant provinces. One man described crossing the Skung deserts of Syria, while another remembered sailing rough seas near Hispania. Younger recruits listened with fascination as experienced soldiers spoke of famous generals, narrow escapes, and unexpected victories. Not every story involved battle. Many spoke of home. A vineyard overlooking the Italian countryside, a bustling marketplace in Gaul. Children left behind years earlier, a wife whose latest letter had finally arrived after months of travel. These conversations reminded everyone that beyond the snow-covered frontier lay an entire world worth protecting. Letters themselves became treasured possessions. Whenever messengers reached the fortress, excitement spread quickly through the barracks. Soldiers gathered around wooden tables, carefully unfolding pieces of parchment or wax tablets bearing familiar handwriting from distant homes. Some could read easily. Others asked friends to read aloud. Those unable to write often sought help from educated companions who patiently recorded messages to families hundreds of kilometers away. Simple words carried enormous emotional weight. I am well. I miss you. I hope to return in the spring. No grand speeches were necessary. Even the shortest letter could brighten an entire week. Religion also remained an important source of comfort. Throughout the empire, Roman soldiers honored many different gods. Small shrines stood within permanent forts, while personal altars often occupied quiet corners of the barracks. Before difficult patrols or during important festivals, soldiers gathered to offer prayers, burn incense, or leave small gifts in hopes of receiving protection and good fortune. For many men, faith brought reassurance during long months of uncertainty. The future remained unknowable, but prayer offered hope. Music occasionally softened the harsh rhythm of military life as well. Professional musicians rarely accompanied frontier garrisons, yet music still found its place inside the fortress. Some soldiers carried simple flutes or pipes. Others sang familiar songs learned during childhood or while marching with the legion. Voices echoed gently through the wooden barracks. The melodies were not grand performances. They did not seek applause. Instead, they filled the cold night with reminders of home, friendship, and shared experience. For a little while, the fortress no longer felt so distant from the rest of the empire. Above all else, winter strengthened the friendships between soldiers. Living together day after day, sharing meals, standing guard through freezing nights, repairing one another's equipment, and enduring the same hardships created bonds unlike any formed during peaceful times. A soldier noticed when his companion grew unusually quiet. He shared an extra blanket with a friend whose cloak had become soaked by snow. He offered part of his evening meal to someone returning late from patrol. These were small acts of kindness. Yet together they created a sense of family far from home. Historians often celebrate the Roman army for its discipline, engineering, and military victories. Those achievements were indeed remarkable. But behind every fortress wall lived ordinary men. They laughed over board games, cheered fortunate throws of dice, shared stories beneath flickering firelight, read treasured letters from loved ones, whispered quiet prayers before sleep, sang familiar melodies that carried memories across countless miles. And through these simple moments, they discovered perhaps the greatest source of strength on the frozen frontier. Not stronger walls, not sharper swords, but the companionship of those who endured the long northern winter together, one evening at a time. When people think about the strength of the Roman Empire, they often imagine disciplined legions, shining armor, and brilliant generals leading soldiers into battle. These images have become symbols of Rome's greatness for centuries. Yet behind every victorious army stood something far less glamorous. A wagon loaded with grain. Without food, fuel, tools and supplies, even the finest soldiers could fight for only a short time. On the empire's frozen northern frontier, where winter could isolate entire fortresses for months, logistics became just as important as military courage. It was an invisible network that quietly sustained Rome's armies long after the excitement of battle had faded. Every successful winter began long before the first snowfall. Months in advance, officials carefully calculated how much food, clothing, firewood, weapons, and equipment each fortress would require. Quartermasters estimated the size of every garrison, measured grain reserves, inspected storage buildings, and prepared for a season when travel would become slow, dangerous, and sometimes impossible. Nothing was left to chance. The Roman supply wagons formed the lifeblood of this system. Long caravans of carts, pulled by oxen or sturdy mules, traveled across the empire carrying everything necessary to keep the frontier alive. Wheat-filled heavy sacks stacked carefully inside wooden wagons. Barrels contained salted meat, olive oil, wine, and vinegar. Blacksmiths' tools, replacement weapons, bundles of clothing, and medical supplies all moved along the same carefully planned routes. These convoys rarely attracted the admiration given to marching legions, yet they were equally important. A victorious army without supplies soon became a starving army. At the center of every permanent fortress stood the granary. These buildings represented one of Rome's greatest engineering achievements. Raised above the ground on sturdy stone supports, they allowed air to circulate beneath stored grain, reducing moisture and protecting precious food from mold. Thick walls shielded supplies from harsh weather, while elevated floors discouraged rats and other animals from reaching the stores. Every sack of wheat inside these buildings represented weeks of survival. The loss of a granary could doom an entire garrison. Roman commanders therefore guarded them with exceptional care. Supplying these granaries depended upon another remarkable achievement: the Roman roads. Stretching for tens of thousands of kilometers across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, these roads connected distant provinces with astonishing efficiency. Built from carefully layered stone, gravel, and sand, they remained usable in conditions that would render many ordinary paths completely impassable. Their famous straight lines were no accident. Roman engineers preferred direct routes whenever possible, reducing travel time and simplifying communication between forts. Even in winters, soldiers worked tirelessly to clear snow, repair damaged surfaces, and remove fallen trees so supply wagons could continue moving. Every repaired road meant another convoy could arrive. Every open route strengthened the frontier. Where roads met rivers, another engineering challenge appeared. Bridges. Roman bridge builders became famous throughout the ancient world for their skill. Massive stone arches crossed broad rivers, while sturdy timber bridges connected more remote regions. These structures transformed dangerous natural barriers into reliable transportation routes. Crossing a river by boat during winter carried enormous risks. Strong currents, floating ice, and freezing temperatures threatened both people and cargo. A permanent bridge eliminated many of these dangers. It allowed wagons, cavalry, merchants, messengers, and entire armies to continue moving despite the season. Of course, not every river possessed a bridge. The empire also relied heavily upon waterways themselves. Whenever conditions permitted, rivers served as natural highways. Barges transported enormous quantities of grain and other supplies far more efficiently than wagons traveling overland. A single river vessel could carry cargo equal to many carts, reducing both travel time and the number of animals required. Before winter ice closed these routes, countless shipments moved toward the frontier. Granaries filled. Storehouses expanded. Every available space was prepared for the difficult months ahead. Grain remained the most valuable cargo of all. The Roman military consumed extraordinary quantities of wheat. Every soldier depended upon regular grain rations, and every horse required its own share of fodder. Feeding a single frontier fortress demanded hundreds of tons of food over the course of a winter. The logistical challenge was immense. Farmers harvested crops hundreds of kilometers away. Merchants transported them to regional warehouse. Officials recorded every shipment. Wagons carried the grain along Roman roads. Boats moved it down rivers whenever possible. Finally, soldiers unloaded the precious cargo into carefully maintained granaries behind fortress walls. Thousands of ordinary people participated in this process. Most never carried a sword. yet each contributed directly to the empire's survival. The Romans understood an important military truth that many later civilizations would rediscover. Battles are won by preparation long before armies meet. A fortress stocked with abundant food could survive months of isolation. Soldiers remained healthy, horses stayed strong, and commanders retained the freedom to choose when and where to fight. By contrast, an army cut off from supplies quickly faced impossible choices. Hunger weakened discipline, cold destroyed morale, disease spread more easily among exhausted men. Eventually, retreat became unavoidable. Rome sought to prevent this outcome through organization rather than luck. Its logistical system became one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. Roads connected distant provinces. Bridges overcame rivers. Warehouses protected vital resources. Supply wagons followed carefully planned schedules. Officials maintained detailed records. Engineers constantly repaired infrastructure damaged by weather or heavy use. Everything worked together as a single, enormous network stretching across an entire continent. The average Roman soldier standing guard atop a snowy frontier wall probably never thought about the countless farmers, builders, sailors, engineers, and administrators whose labor made his evening meal possible. He simply received his ration of bread, his bowl of porridge, his piece of smoked meat, his warm fire. Yet each of those simple comforts represented an extraordinary chain of planning and cooperation extending far beyond the fortress gates. Perhaps this was Rome's greatest hidden strength. Its empire was not held together by military power alone. It endured because thousands of people, separated by mountains, rivers, forests, and vast distances, worked together through one of history's most remarkable logistical systems. On the frozen northern frontier, where winter threatened to isolate every fortress beneath snow and ice, that invisible network became just as powerful as the legions themselves. In many ways, it was the true foundation upon which Rome's northern empire stood. Winter brought silence to Rome's northern frontier. The forests stood motionless beneath heavy snow. Rivers froze into pale ribbons stretching across the landscape, while distant hills disappeared beneath low clouds. To an unfamiliar traveler, the frontier might have seemed peaceful, almost asleep beneath its blanket of white. The Roman soldiers knew better. Winter did not end danger. It simply changed its shape. Beyond the empire's borders lived many Germanic tribes, each with its own customs, leaders, and territories. They were not one united nation, but a collection of independent peoples who understood the forests, rivers, and mountains of the north far better than any outsider. They had grown up in these harsh climates, learning from childhood how to travel through deep snow, survive freezing nights, and navigate dense woodlands, where strangers quickly became lost. For the Romans, this local knowledge made them formidable opponents. A Roman legion preferred open ground, where disciplined formations could maneuver together behind locked shields, but winter often denied them that advantage. Snow narrowed roads, thick forests restricted movement, and frozen terrain forced soldiers into long marching columns that were far more vulnerable than the famous battle lines celebrated throughout history. These conditions created opportunities for surprise attacks. Ambushes became one of the greatest dangers. Imagine a patrol moving slowly along a snow-covered forest path. Every footstep leaves a dark impression in the untouched snow. The only sounds are the crunch of boots and the distant call of winter birds. Then everything falls silent. From behind snow-covered trees, hidden warriors suddenly emerge. Spears fly through the cold air before disappearing once again among the pines. The attack lasts only moments. By the time the Romans organized themselves, Their opponents have already vanished into the wilderness. Such encounters demanded constant vigilance. The frontier itself became an unpredictable battlefield where the landscape often favored those who knew it best. Night raids brought another challenge. Winter nights in the north were long and exceptionally dark. Snow reflected pale moonlight across open ground, but forests remained almost completely black. Small groups of raiders sometimes used this darkness to approach isolated watch posts, steal livestock, burn supply wagons, or test the defenses of Roman forts. Their objective was rarely to conquer a fortress outright. Instead, they sought to create uncertainty. A single successful raid forced commanders to strengthen defenses, increase patrols, and keep wary soldiers awake for even longer hours. Fatigue became another weapon. To counter these threats, the Romans relied upon one of their greatest strengths: routine. Patrols continued regardless of the weather. Small detachments left the fortress every day, following familiar routes through nearby forests, along frozen rivers, and across open ground. They searched for unusual footprints in fresh snow, broken branches, abandoned campfires, or any other sign that unfamiliar groups had entered the area. Snow itself became an unexpected ally. Unlike dry summer soil, fresh snowfall preserved clear tracks. Experienced scouts could estimate how many people had passed, whether they traveled on foot or horseback, and even how recently they had crossed a particular route. The winter landscape remembered every movement. High above these patrols stood the watchtowers. Positioned along important roads, rivers, and sections of the frontier, these towers extended Rome's vision far beyond the fortress walls. Guards spent long hours scanning the horizon, their eyes searching for rising smoke, moving figures, or anything unusual against the white landscape. The duty demanded patience. Most days nothing happened, but the value of a watchtower lay in those rare moments when something did. A distant group moving across a frozen valley, a signal fire burning where none should exist. The sudden appearance of riders approaching from beyond the frontier. Early warning gave commanders precious time to respond. Communication between towers became essential. If danger appeared, alarms spread rapidly across the frontier. Horns echoed through the cold air, while signal fires or columns of smoke carried messages from one outpost to another. Within minutes, nearby forts could prepare their defenses, close their gates, arm their soldiers, and dispatch reinforcements if necessary. The system was simple. It was also remarkably effective. Every soldier understood his role the moment an alarm sounded. Guards hurried to the walls. Archers gathered ammunition. Officers organized defensive positions. Stable hands prepared horses for messengers or cavalry patrols. There was little confusion because every procedure had been practiced repeatedly throughout the winter. Fortunately, not every alarm ended in battle. Many suspicious tracks belonged to hunters. Some distant fires marked peaceful travelers seeking warmth. Others simply disappeared beneath fresh snowfall before their origin could be discovered. Yet the Romans preferred caution over complacency. On the northern frontier, assuming that everything was safe could prove fatal. As another winter night settled across the forests, the fortress gates closed once more. Sentries tightened their wool cloaks against the icy wind, while watchtowers stood silhouetted beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. Beyond the walls, unseen figures might still be moving silently through the snow. Inside, the Roman garrison remained ready, not because they expected danger every moment, but because discipline had taught them never to ignore the quiet warnings of a frozen frontier. In this land of snow, forests, and endless winter nights, survival depended not only on courage in battle, but on patience, vigilance, and the ability to see danger long before it reached the gates. On Rome's frozen northern frontier, survival was never achieved by soldiers alone. Every fortress, every convoy, and every winter patrol depended upon loyal companions that rarely appear in stories of the Roman army. They wore no armor, carried no shields, and received no medals for their service. Yet without them, many Roman garrisons would have struggled to endure the long, unforgiving winters. These companions were the animals that shared the frontier with the legions. The most familiar of them was the horse. To the Romans, horses were far more than mounts for cavalry. They carried messengers across vast distances, allowing urgent news to travel from one fortress to another far faster than any soldier on foot. During emergencies, a rider could race through snow-covered roads with orders that might save an entire garrison. Cavalry horses also played an essential role in winter patrols. While deep snow often slowed movement, experienced riders could still cover large stretches of frontier, checking isolated watchtowers, escorting supply wagons, or searching for signs of hostile activity. A mounted scout could observe much more territory in a single day than an infantry patrol struggling through knee-deep snow. The horses themselves demanded constant care. Every evening they were rubbed dry after returning from the cold, their hooves carefully inspected for cracks caused by frozen ground. Stable workers ensured that fresh hay, grain, and clean water were always available, knowing that a weak horse could endanger an important mission. Alongside the horses worked another indispensable animal, the mule. If horses represented speed, mules represented endurance. Roman armies relied heavily on these sturdy animals because they carry heavy loads across rough terrain with remarkable reliability. Supply wagons frequently depended upon teams of mules, while individual pack animals transported sacks of grain, barrels of wine, bundles of firewood, blacksmith's tools, spare weapons, and countless other necessities. Unlike many horses, mules remained calm under difficult conditions. They navigated narrow mountain paths, muddy roads, and snowy trails with impressive confidence. Their sure-footed nature made them invaluable during winter, when a single misplaced step could overturn valuable supplies or injure both animal and handler. Every successful convoy owed much to their quiet strength. Dogs also earned an important place within Roman military life. Although they rarely fought alongside soldiers in the dramatic manner portrayed in modern fiction, dogs served practical purposes throughout the frontier. Their keen hearing and sharp sense of smell often detected unfamiliar movements long before human guards noticed anything unusual. A barking dog during the middle of the night immediately drew attention. Sometimes it warned of approaching strangers. Sometimes it merely announced the arrival of friendly patrols returning through the snow. Either way, the animal provided another layer of security for the fortress. Dogs also accompanied hunting parties beyond the walls. Winter reduced the availability of fresh food, making successful hunts especially valuable. Skilled hunting dogs tracked scents hidden beneath snow, helping soldiers locate deer, wild boar, rabbits, and other animals that supplemented the fortress stores. Although preserved food remained the foundation of the Roman diet, occasional fresh meat provided welcome variety after months of bread, porridge, smoked pork, and cheese. Hunting offered more than nutrition, it strengthened morale. For a short time, soldiers escaped the routine of fortress life and entered the silent forests, relying upon teamwork, patience, and the instincts of their animal companions. Within the fortress itself lived other valuable animals. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs formed an essential part of the military economy whenever space and local conditions allowed. These animals supplied milk, meat, leather, wool, and other resources that reduced dependence upon distant supply convoys. Sheep were particularly important. Their wool became warm clothing, blankets, socks, cloaks, and countless other items that protected soldiers from the freezing northern climate. Every repaired cloak or newly woven blanket reminded the garrison that survival often began long before winter arrived. Goats and cattle contributed milk, which could be transformed into cheese, a food that stored well throughout the cold season and provided valuable nutrition. Even after an animal's life ended, little was wasted. Leather became boots, belts, harnesses, and shields. Bones became tools. Horns became containers or drinking vessels. Every part found a purpose. The Romans believed that efficiency was a form of strength. Winter demanded exactly that attitude. Feeding animals throughout the cold months required careful planning. Hay had to be harvested during summer and stored in dry barns before snow covered the fields. Grain rations were measured carefully, ensuring that valuable livestock survived until spring without exhausting the fortress supplies. The responsibility was considerable. Healthy animals meant reliable transport, warm clothing, fresh food, and continued mobility. Weak animals threatened the entire garrison. As another winter evening settled over the frontier, the sounds of the fortress slowly changed. Horses shifted quietly inside their stables. Mules rested after another difficult journey. Sheep gathered together against the cold. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked briefly before silence returned once more. To many Roman soldiers these familiar sounds brought comfort. They were reminders that life continued despite the snow, the freezing winds, and the long nights. The animals shared the same hardships, depended upon the same careful preparation, and contributed to the same common goal. History remembers the Roman Empire for its disciplined legions and brilliant commanders. Yet hidden behind those famous achievements stood countless faithful animals whose strength, endurance, and companionship quietly helped keep the frontier alive. Together, humans and animals formed a partnership that allowed Rome to survive where winter seemed determined to conquer everyone who entered its frozen world. Throughout Roman history, countless victories were won through discipline, careful planning, and remarkable military skill. Generals celebrated triumphant campaigns, cities erected monuments, and historians filled their scrolls with tales of courage on distant battlefields. Yet some of Rome's greatest defeats were not inflicted by enemy armies. They were delivered by winter. No commander, no matter how experienced, could negotiate with a snowstorm. No legion, regardless of its discipline, could simply march through a blizzard without consequence. On the empire's northern frontiers, nature often proved to be a more patient, relentless, and unforgiving opponent than any tribe beyond the border. Campaigns that appeared successful during autumn could quickly become disasters once winter arrived. Roads disappeared beneath deep snow. Frozen rivers blocked familiar routes. Mountain passes became impossible to cross. Supply wagons slowed to a crawl or vanished entirely, trapped beneath heavy drifts or abandoned when exhausted animals could no longer continue. Messages that once traveled in days suddenly required weeks, leaving distant commanders isolated from one another. An army cut off from its supplies was already fighting a losing battle. Hunger arrived gradually. At first, soldiers simply received smaller portions. Bread became thinner. The bowls of porridge were filled with more water than grain. Salted meat was reserved for only the hardest duties, while precious stores of cheese and dried foods disappeared one ration at a time. Officers carefully counted every remaining sack of wheat, knowing that each decision might determine whether the garrison survived until spring. Eventually, there was nothing left to reduce except hope. Cold magnified every hardship. Hungry soldiers found it increasingly difficult to produce enough body heat to stay warm. Exhaustion slowed their movements. Muscles weakened. Illness spread more easily among men already struggling to survive. Even simple tasks, such as carrying firewood or standing guard for a few hours, demanded enormous physical effort. The enemy did not need to attack. Winter was already doing the work. Sometimes entire marching columns simply disappeared beneath the weather. Heavy snowstorms reduced visibility to only a few steps. Familiar roads vanished beneath white drifts. Wagons overturned, horses became trapped, and exhausted soldiers lost contact with one another in the swirling wind. Those who wandered away from the main column often faced impossible odds of finding their companions again before darkness fell. A snowfall could erase not only the landscape but an army's sense of direction. Ancient writers occasionally described winters so severe that rivers froze solid, forests became nearly impassable, and snow buried camps beneath astonishing depth. Whether every detail was perfectly accurate or somewhat exaggerated by dramatic storytelling, their accounts reveal an undeniable truth. The northern climate inspired genuine fear. It challenged the confidence of even Rome's most experienced commanders. Winter attacked more than the body. It wore down the mind. Imagine weeks without seeing the sun clearly through heavy clouds. Imagine endless grey skies, freezing winds, and nights that seemed to last forever. Day after day, the same routines continued while spring felt impossibly far away. Homesickness grew stronger. Letters arrived less frequently. News from distant families became uncertain. Some soldiers began questioning whether they would ever return home. Military discipline remained essential, but discipline alone could not erase loneliness. Roman officers therefore watched morale as carefully as food supplies. They understood that despair spread almost as quickly as disease. A discouraged army made poor decisions, worked less efficiently, and found it harder to endure the countless small hardships that winter imposed every single day. Fortunately, experience gradually taught the Romans how to prepare. Each difficult winter became another lesson. Engineers improved roads and fortresses. Quartermasters stored larger food reserves. Builders strengthened roofs against heavy snow. Commanders planned campaigns more carefully, avoiding unnecessary risks as the seasons changed. The empire adapted because it had no other choice. Ancient historians such as Julius Caesar and later Roman writers occasionally described the brutal conditions faced by soldiers campaigning in Gaul, Germania, and Britannia. Their accounts remind us that the Roman army's greatest achievements were measured not only in battles won, but in winters survived. Every fortress that remained standing until spring represented a quiet victory. Every supply convoy that reached its destination despite snow and ice strengthened the frontier. Every soldier who returned home after months of freezing hardship carried a story that would never appear in a triumphal procession. When we look back upon the Roman Empire today, it is easy to admire its magnificent roads, towering aqueducts, disciplined legions, and legendary conquests. Yet hidden beneath those remarkable accomplishments lies another story, one told not by monuments of marble, but by footprints disappearing into fresh snow. It is the story of ordinary men who discovered that the harshest enemy often wore no armor, carried no banner, and spoke no language. It arrived with the first snowfall. It tested every fortress, every supply line, every friendship, and every ounce of determination. And time after time, the Roman legions proved that while they could not conquer winter itself, they could endure it. In the end, that endurance became one of the greatest victories the empire would ever achieve. no winter lasted forever. Even on Rome's distant northern frontier, where snow covered the landscape for months and icy winds seemed endless, every soldier knew that spring would eventually return. The question was never if it would arrive. The question was when. For men stationed along the Rhine, the Danube, or the misty frontiers of Britannia, waiting became a skill in itself. The Roman army was built upon movement. Legions marched, engineers built roads, cavalry patrolled vast territories, and commanders launched carefully planned campaigns. Winter interrupted that rhythm. It slowed the empire's heartbeat, forcing thousands of soldiers into a season defined not by conquest, but by patience. The waiting could feel endless. Morning after morning, soldiers climbed the fortress walls to find the same familiar sight. Snow stretched across the countryside in every direction. Rivers remained locked beneath thick sheets of ice. Forests stood silent beneath heavy white branches, while cold winds swept through the valleys with little sign that the seasons were changing. One day looked much like the one before it. Weeks blended into months. Yet beneath this apparent stillness, the Roman army never stopped preparing. One of the first signs that winter was beginning to loosen its grip came from the roads. The famous Roman highways, buried beneath snow for much of the season, slowly began to reappear as temperatures rose. Meltwater trickled through carefully engineered drainage ditches, while patches of exposed stone emerged from beneath the ice. This change brought both relief and new challenges. Snow gave way to mud. Heavy wagons that had once struggled through drifts now risked becoming trapped in soft ground. Bridges had to be inspected after months of freezing weather, and damaged roads demanded immediate repair before large armies could begin moving once again. The soldiers knew that every repaired road shortened the distance to the next campaign. Inside the fortress, activity increased noticeably. Weapons that had rested during the harshest weeks of winter were carefully inspected. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly beside glowing furnaces, sharpening swords, repairing spearheads, replacing damaged shield fittings, and forging fresh iron nails for military boots. Armor received equal attention. Mail shirts were examined ring by ring. Leather straps were replaced. Helmets were polished, not for appearance alone, but to reveal hidden cracks or weaknesses that might fail in battle. A neglected weapon endangered not only its owner, but the entire formation. Preparation left little room for carelessness. The workshops echoed with the sounds of hammers from dawn until evening. Nearby, carpenters repaired wagons that had suffered under months of freezing temperatures. Wheels warped by moisture were strengthened. Axles were replaced. Broken harnesses were stitched together using fresh leather. Every vehicle would soon be needed again. The frontier also welcomed a new generation of soldiers. Winter often provided an ideal opportunity to train recruits. Large campaigns were relatively uncommon during the harshest months, allowing experienced veterans to devote time to teaching young legionaries the countless skills required for military life. The lessons extended far beyond swordsmanship. New recruits learned how to march in formation across icy ground without breaking ranks. They practiced constructing fortified camps, maintaining weapons, caring for animals, and surviving the unpredictable northern climate. Veterans demonstrated the small habits that no written manual could fully explain. How to keep feet dry during a snow march. How to recognize dangerous ice on a river. How to wrap a wool cloak against freezing wind. How to preserve strength during long patrols. These quiet lessons, passed from one generation to the next, often proved more valuable than any individual battle. Commanders, meanwhile, devoted countless hours to planning. Large wooden tables inside headquarters became covered with maps, reports and messages arriving from neighboring forts. Scouts described changes along the frontier. Supply officers calculated grain reserves. Engineers estimated how quickly damaged bridges could be repaired. Every piece of information mattered. No Roman campaign began without careful preparation. Unlike the dramatic charges often portrayed in films, real military success usually depended upon decisions made months before the first sword was drawn. The coming of spring demanded coordination across an enormous empire. One fortress alone could accomplish little. Multiple legions needed supplies, fresh horses, repaired roads, reliable bridges, and secure communication before any large operation became possible. Rome excelled because it prepared systematically. While winter still lingered outside, the empire was already looking ahead. As daylight slowly grew longer, morale changed almost as noticeably as the weather. The sun remained visible a little later each evening. Birdsong gradually returned to the forests. Snow retreated from rooftops and open fields, revealing patches of brown earth beneath. Small streams, silent for months beneath thick ice, began flowing once more. These simple changes lifted spirits throughout the garrison. Conversations increasingly turned toward the future. Where would the legion march next? Would they remain on the frontier or be transferred elsewhere? Would this year's campaign bring victory or simply another winter far from home? Hope returned with the changing season, not because the hardships had been forgotten, but because they had been endured. The soldiers who emerged from winter were not the same men who had entered it months earlier. They had survived freezing nights upon the walls. They had shared dwindling supplies. They had repaired buildings, cleared roads, buried comrades, trained recruits, and protected one another through one of nature's harshest tests. Now they stood ready once again. When the first supply wagons rolled freely along the thawing roads, and cavalry patrols ventured farther beyond the frontier, the fortress slowly awakened from its winter rhythm. The waiting was over. Soon the banners would rise. The marching columns would form. The familiar sound of thousands of boots striking Roman roads would echo across the countryside once again. Winter had delayed the empire. It had challenged its endurance, but had not stopped Rome. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson every legionary carried into the spring, that victory was never achieved simply by winning battles. Sometimes, the greatest triumph was surviving long enough to fight another campaign. By the time a Roman soldier completed several winters on the empire's northern frontier, he was no longer the same man who had first arrived from the warmer provinces of Italy, Gaul, or Hispania. The frontier changed everyone. It transformed young recruits into seasoned veterans, challenged experienced commanders to rethink long-held traditions, and forced the Roman army to adapt in ways that would influence its military for generations. The frozen lands beyond the Alps became more than a distant border. They became one of Rome's greatest classrooms. Every winter taught lessons that no military manual could fully explain. One of the first and most visible changes appeared in the soldiers themselves. When Rome first expanded northward, many legionaries wore clothing designed for the mild Mediterranean climate. Short tunics, open military sandals, and relatively light cloaks served well beneath the Italian sun, but proved inadequate against the icy winds of Germania and Britannia. Winter quickly exposed these weaknesses. Rather than stubbornly clinging to tradition, the Romans adapted. Layered wool garments became increasingly common. Long trousers, once viewed by many Romans as for even uncivilized, gradually earned acceptance because they simply worked. Enclosed boots replaced or supplemented traditional footwear in colder regions. Woolen socks, gloves, and hooded cloaks became essential equipment for frontier service. It was a practical revolution. Rome learned that survival depended not upon preserving appearances, but upon embracing useful ideas wherever they originated. The northern frontier also reshaped Roman military engineering. Every evening spent constructing temporary camps reinforced one important truth: shelter saved lives. The Romans had always been skilled builders, but winter demanded even greater precision. Camps required effective drainage to prevent melting snow from flooding sleeping quarters. Defensive ditches had to remain functional despite frozen ground. Barracks became better insulated, while permanent forts evolved into carefully organized communities capable of supporting thousands of soldiers throughout the coldest months of the year. These improvements did not remain confined to the frontier. Engineers carried their knowledge across the empire, applying hard-earned experience wherever new forts were built. The result was a military infrastructure that became increasingly resilient with every generation. Perhaps no lesson proved more valuable than logistics. The northern winters demonstrated that armies marched not merely on courage, but on preparation. Every loaf of bread consumed in January depended upon grain harvested months earlier. Every warm fire required wood collected before the first snowfall. Every healthy horse depended upon carefully stored hay. Every repaired weapon relied upon blacksmiths, who had worked throughout the winter. Rome's supply system became a masterpiece of organization because failure carried such severe consequences. A delayed convoy could mean hunger. An empty granary could mean defeat. Over time, Roman commanders recognized that successful campaigns were won as much in warehouses, workshops, and supply depots as they were on battlefields. This understanding became one of the empire's greatest strategic advantages. Winter warfare itself also became an education. Early campaigns had shown how dangerous frozen landscapes could be. Snow concealed obstacles, rivers became unpredictable, and forests offered ideal locations for ambushes. Soldiers learned never to underestimate weather or unfamiliar terrain. Instead of resisting the environment, they adapted to it. Patrol routes changed with the seasons. Watchtowers expanded their importance. Supply schedules shifted to account for approaching snow. Scouts learned to read tracks left in fresh snowfall, while commanders carefully balanced military ambition against the realities of winter travel. These experiences gradually transformed the Roman army into one of the most adaptable fighting forces of the ancient world. Knowledge spread through the ranks. Veterans returning from the frontier became instructors for younger recruits. Around evening campfires and inside crowded barracks, experienced soldiers shared practical advice that no official handbook could fully capture. How to prevent frostbite. How to recognize dangerous river ice. How to keep weapons functioning in freezing temperatures. How to build fires that produced maximum warmth while conserving fuel. These lessons passed quietly from one generation to the next. Each veteran became a living library of survival. Future legions benefited enormously from this accumulated experience. A soldier stationed along the Danube decades later often enjoyed better clothing, stronger fortifications, more reliable supply systems, and improved training because earlier generations had endured and learned from the hardships of the northern frontier. Progress came slowly, but it came steadily. Each winter left behind new ideas. Each challenge produced another solution. In many ways, the frontier itself became an instructor. Its lessons were demanding. Its examinations were unforgiving. Yet those who survived carried knowledge more valuable than any written order. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all was one of humility. The Roman Empire possessed magnificent roads, disciplined armies, remarkable engineers, and extraordinary wealth. It conquered kingdoms across 3 continents and ruled millions of people. Yet on the frozen frontier, nature reminded Rome that power alone was never enough. Even the mightiest empire could not command the seasons. It could not prevent rivers from freezing. It could not order snow to stop falling. What it could do was prepare, adapt. Again and again, winter forced Rome to abandon pride in favor of practicality. Instead of insisting that old methods were always best, the army observed, experimented, improved, and evolved. That willingness to learn became one of the empire's defining strengths. Looking back across the centuries, the Roman frontier was far more than a defensive border, separating civilization from the unknown. It was a proving ground. A place where every snowfall tested engineering, every frozen river challenged logistics, every bitter wind questioned discipline, and every winter rewarded those willing to adapt. The greatest legacy of Rome's northern frontier was not simply that the empire survived its harsh winters. It was that those winters transformed the Roman army into a stronger, wiser, and more resilient force, one whose hard-earned lessons echoed through the legions long after the snow had melted. As another winter slowly faded from the northern frontier, the Roman fortresses remained standing. The snow that had buried roads and watchtowers for months gradually melted into rushing streams. Frozen rivers awakened once again, carrying broken sheets of ice toward distant seas. The forests, silent throughout the long winter, slowly filled with birdsong as the first signs of spring returned. For the soldiers, another season of survival had come to an end. They had not merely endured the cold, they had earned it. Looking back across everything they had experienced, one truth became impossible to ignore. Rome did not survive because it possessed the sharpest swords. Iron alone could never defeat winter. No shield could block a blizzard. No spear could overcome hunger. No military formation could force frozen rivers to thaw. Nature obeyed no emperor. Instead, Rome endured because its greatest strength lay elsewhere. It lived in discipline. Every morning, soldiers rose before dawn despite freezing temperatures. They trained when their hands were numb from the cold. They repaired roads buried beneath snow, stood watch through endless nights, and carried out their duties whether anyone praised them or not. Discipline transformed ordinary men into a dependable army. Each individual understood that survival depended not only upon personal courage, but upon everyone performing their responsibilities without fail. If one guard abandoned his post, the fortress became vulnerable. If one worker neglected the granary, hundreds might go hungry. If one convoy failed to arrive, an entire winter could end in disaster. Every task mattered. Rome also endured because of its extraordinary organization. Nothing inside a frontier fortress happened by accident. Food was counted months before it was needed. Firewood was gathered long before the first snowfall. Barracks were inspected, wells maintained, roads repaired, and supplies distributed according to carefully established routines. Behind every warm meal stood countless hours of planning. Behind every successful patrol stood detailed preparation. The Roman army understood something that remains true today. Order creates resilience. Another pillar of Rome's endurance was logistics. Throughout this journey, we have seen how wagons carried grain across hundreds of kilometers, how engineers built roads and bridges, how granaries protected precious harvests, and how supply officers ensured that every soldier received the necessities of life. These achievements rarely appeared in heroic stories, yet they quietly sustained the empire through its greatest hardships. Without logistics, courage soon becomes exhaustion. Without supplies, victory becomes impossible. Perhaps the most remarkable strength of all was Rome's ability to adapt. The empire was born beneath the warm skies of the Mediterranean, Yet it refused to remain limited by its origins. Roman soldiers learned to wear layered wool clothing instead of relying solely on traditional uniforms. They improved their footwear for snow and ice. They adopted practical ideas from local peoples when experience proved those ideas effective. They strengthened fortresses, refined winter routines, and transformed every hardship into another lesson. Rome survived because it never stopped learning. This willingness to change separated it from many of its rivals. The northern frontier became far more than a military border. It became a classroom. Every snowfall tested preparation. Every frozen river tested engineering. Every winter storm tested leadership. Every long night tested morale. The true examination of a Roman legion was not always fought beneath bright banners on open battlefields. Often it took place in silence, inside a snow-covered fortress, beside a fading fire, on a lonely watchtower overlooking a frozen forest. Far from the glory of triumphal parades, ordinary soldiers proved what the Roman army was truly made of. When we remember the Roman Empire today, it is tempting to measure its greatness by the lands it conquered or the battles it won. But perhaps its greatest achievement was something quieter. An empire from the Mediterranean learned how to live in a world of ice. It learned how to prepare instead of panic, how to organize instead of improvise, and how to adapt instead of surrender. That was the real victory over winter. Not the defeat of nature, for no empire could accomplish that, but the determination to face it, endure it, and emerge stronger with every passing season. In the end, winter was never simply another season for the Roman legions. It was their greatest test, and generation after generation they passed it. As the sun slowly disappears beyond the northern horizon, the frontier falls silent once again. Snow drifts gently across the ancient landscape, covering the weathered stones of Roman forts that have stood for nearly 2,000 years. Their walls are broken, their watchtowers no longer guarded, yet they remain as quiet witnesses to an extraordinary chapter of history. Standing among these ruins, it is easy to imagine the legionaries who once called this frozen frontier home. For them, winter was never simply another season. It was an invisible enemy. Unlike an army marching beneath colorful banners, winter gave no warning. It crept into frozen boots, emptied granaries, buried roads beneath snow, spread illness through crowded barracks, and tested every soldier long after the sounds of battle had faded. Many men who survived fierce combat would discover that the cold demanded an entirely different kind of courage. Yet Rome endured. Not because its swords were sharper than those of its enemies, not because its walls were taller, but because its soldiers believed in discipline, even when no battle was being fought, because its engineers built fortresses that could withstand months of ice and wind, because its supply system carried food across impossible distances, and because thousands of ordinary men trusted one another through countless long nights. From the windswept frontiers of Britannia to the frozen forests beyond Germania, their greatest victories were often the quiet ones. A warm meal after a freezing patrol, a repaired roof before another snowfall, a convoy arriving just in time, a friend standing beside you through another endless winter night. As darkness settles over the frontier, one final campfire flickers against the snow. Its warm glow pushes back the shadows for a little while delicate snowflakes continue to fall beneath the endless sky. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Roman Empire left behind. Its true strength was not forged only in glorious victories or celebrated triumphs. It was forged here around the warmth of a fire, beneath silent winter stars, where endurance became every bit as heroic as conquest. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through history with Chronicles. If you enjoyed this story and would like to explore more peaceful journeys into the past, please subscribe to the channel. Until our next adventure, wherever you are in the world, may your evening be peaceful, your thoughts be calm, and your night be filled with restful dreams.